Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
There's even more evidence today of the mounting pressure on the NHS in England this winter. New figures compiled by the BBC show that for the last 6 weeks of 2017, more than 75,000 patients were left in ambulances for 30 minutes or more. That's 1 in every 8 patients enduring a delay. And last week was the busiest ever for the NHS 111 helpline. It received more than 480,000 calls. Today, Theresa May apologised for the thousands of operations that have already been cancelled. Our health editor Hugh Pym reports.
But we're in a queue with lots of other people who are clearly very sick. Everybody's waiting to get in.
A patient's eye view of the stress across the NHS. A queue of ambulances waiting to hand over patients at a hospital. Leah was stuck for more than an hour in the ambulance with her mother, who was at that moment having a stroke.
It's just gobsmacking. It's gobsmacking and it's devastating. It feels like a sick feeling, like a sickening feeling of that this is how bad it is.
One chief executive even tweeted a picture of ambulances at his hospital, Wigan Infirmary. A lovely fleet of 14 parked outside the door, he said. Handover delays at hospitals are not good news for patients, and they stop ambulances getting back on the road again. The process at A&E units are supposed to take no more than 15 minutes. But the latest figures for England show a sharp increase in the numbers waiting more than 30 minutes. BBC analysis shows that across the system since the end of November, 1 in 8 have been held up more than half an hour. The northwest and eastern regions saw some of the biggest numbers of long ambulance waits at hospitals. Some of the best performers were in London and the west of England. The Prime Minister was asked again about the government's response with NHS England to the extreme pressure in many hospitals, postponing a month's worth of non-urgent operations.
I recognise that it's difficult if somebody is delayed on their admission to hospital or if somebody has an operation postponed, and we will hope to ensure that those operations can be reinstated as soon as possible. I know it's difficult, I know it's frustrating, I know it's disappointing for people, and I apologise.
No, I just wondered if you had any update from Daddy?
There are problems for the NHS across the UK. Karen's 86-year-old father in Northern Ireland, who had a chest infection, had to wait more than 26 hours for a hospital bed.
There were people on the floor, there were people sitting on chairs. Most of them were elderly. There was an elderly lady that I remember very vividly who was slumped in a chair in her nightdress the whole night. No one came near her. No one even put a blanket around her. It was really very distressing. There were police everywhere. There were people with blood pouring out of them. It was just like a battlefield.
And now there are official figures showing that flu is putting more pressure on hospitals.
What we are seeing is a significant increase in this particular week from the last week in terms of the numbers of people being admitted to hospital and the numbers of people who are being admitted to intensive care.
It's too soon to say how severe the flu season will be, but it won't take much to add to the long waits and delays, as illustrated in these pictures, already evident across the NHS. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Let's go live to the Royal Preston Hospital and our correspondent Dominic Hughes. Dominic, what's the situation there? How is the hospital coping?
Well, NHS data, George, tells us that the Lancashire Teaching Hospitals, of which the Royal Preston is part, has the worst ambulance handovers in England. We know that more than half of all the ambulances that attended A&E had to wait more than 30 minutes before discharging their patients over to A&E, and of those, 1 in 5 had to wait for more than 60 minutes. Now, as Hugh said in his piece, it is a very mixed picture. In the southwest of England, in London, in the northeast, waiting times are much lower. But the problems in A&E reflect pressures throughout the system, in community care, in social care, in GP services, because A&E is the front door to the NHS for so many patients. And if the hospitals can't discharge patients from their wards into the community, then A&E staff can't move their patients off their department onto those wards. And that affects the ambulance handover times. So really what happens at A&E, George, reflects pressures right across the system that is really beginning to struggle with the pressures of winter.
All right, Dominic, thank you very much.
Now, the Prime Minister went to hospital today, not for an emergency admission, but to apologise for the cancellation of operations caused by winter pressures on the NHS in England. Her visit came as figures covering the Christmas week showed record numbers of calls to the 111 service and bed occupancy as high as 93.5%. Our Health and Social Affairs correspondent Victoria MacDonald has this report.
Yet another person arriving in A&E today, this time the Prime Minister. There were no queues or breaches of the 4-hour wait. She was straight in.
Hello, hello.
Yesterday, Mrs May had said there was no crisis in the NHS, but today she did apologise for the 50,000 non-urgent operations postponed while trusts cope with the winter pressures.
We will hope to ensure that those operations can be reinstated as soon as possible. I know it's difficult, I know it's frustrating, I know it's disappointing for people, and I apologise.
On Tuesday, a consultant also said sorry for the third world conditions in his hospital's emergency department, while over the week dozens of trusts have been put on the highest level of alert, closing their A&E departments to admissions.
Even if the Prime Minister doesn't think that there is a crisis in the NHS, there is no getting away from the fact that the service is under relentless pressure, and today's figures show that. Record number of calls to the 111 service, too many delays for ambulance staff handing over patients to A&E departments, and too many patients in hospital beds.
The operational figures from NHS England are for the week between Christmas and New Year. They show delayed ambulance handovers, nearly 17,000 patients forced to wait for more than 30 minutes before being seen by emergency department staff. 4,700 were delayed for more than an hour. Calls to the 111 service reached 480,000, the most received in a single week since it was created. And bed occupancy, it climbed to 93.5% on New Year's Eve, well above the recommended safe limit of 85%. The Royal London Hospital in the East End was busy today, but coping.
If we're busy in our emergency department, the whole hospital responds and comes down to help or do whatever is necessary. And the result of that is that people down in the emergency department don't feel on their own and isolated. They've got access to whatever help they need when they need it.
So it never feels like it's getting out of control?
That's the way it's designed. We don't want this place to feel unsafe, and it doesn't feel unsafe at the moment.
How are you going to manage at home? Because I know
Frances Adair was being assessed in a side room of the A&E unit as we arrived to see if they could avoid admitting her to a ward. She'd had a fall and brought herself to the hospital by taxi.
Did it feel busy?
Yeah, really busy. Yeah, really busy. I mean, and I knew that when I come, I was going to have a long wait. I didn't think, oh, I'm going to go in, come out, and that's it. You know, I knew that I'd have to wait, but it didn't matter because this is my hospital. I hope they let me go home, but with some decent pain relief.
But for struggling trusts, those already under pressure, this is the problem. Winter has hardly begun and flu levels are beginning to climb across the UK, raising real concerns for how they will cope over the next few weeks.
And our fact-check team have been crunching the numbers on the NHS. For their latest findings, go to channel4.com/factcheck.
If you were watching last night, you'll have seen us discussing whether the Prime Minister and her Health Secretary were actually talking to each other. He'd said sorry, she'd insisted the health service was better placed than ever to cope. But today there were some particularly bleak midwinter figures from NHS England about how services have been coping, or in many cases, frankly, not coping. In the week between Christmas and New Year, there was a sharp rise in ambulance waits outside A&E, bed occupancy rates were well above guidelines, and nearly 500,000 people called the 111 hotline in those 7 days, the most since the service actually came into being. All of which perhaps left the Prime Minister in the end with little choice. Yes, she said she too was sorry.
As the crisis deepens, so too do the ambulances back up outside hospitals and patients stack up inside them on trolleys. This video from Essex shows the queue of ambulances waiting to offload sick patients.
As our ambulance crew have been sharing with us that there's 73 outstanding ambulances right now. That means there's 73 people sitting in their homes desperately waiting for someone to come and collect them.
The woman who filmed them was with her elderly mother who'd had a stroke.
I can't fathom the fact that
you can go in an ambulance having a stroke and sit outside for hours waiting to be seen. And there are other people with so many other concerns and conditions that are also desperate to be helped.
In the last week of 2017, there were nearly 17,000 people waiting in ambulances more than 30 minutes, up by 40% on the previous week. Of those, 4,700 had to wait at least an hour. That's an increase of 95%. On New Year's Eve, bed occupancy rates climbed to 93.5%. That's above the recommended limit of 85%. It was also the busiest week for the NHS 111 phone service, with almost 500,000 calls. The Prime Minister today visited a Surrey hospital as more evidence emerged about the strain on NHS resources. With tens of thousands of non-urgent operations in England now postponed, she apologised for the state of the health service.
We will hope to ensure that those operations can be reinstated as soon as possible. I know it's difficult, I know it's frustrating, I know it's disappointing for people, and I apologise.
This is a great trust. You do a fantastic job.
Meeting hospital staff, she thanked them for their hard work, but her words didn't convince all who heard them.
It's really hard when you hear people saying there isn't a crisis and you come in to find there's 10 trolleys in the corridor, because if that isn't a crisis, I don't know what is.
Today it was the turn of the Prime Minister to apologise. Yesterday, the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. The NHS may be under critical pressure, possibly even reaching a tipping point. But the politicians who fund it are under political pressure now as well. But as Labour accused the government of underfunding, there was criticism of the Labour-run health service in Wales, also under pressure.
Everywhere in Wales over Christmas there have been out-of-hours centres closed, shifts have been unfilled, often about one in every 7. So the pressures on the out-of-hours service, which lead to additional pressures, of course, on ambulances, lead to additional pressures on emergency rooms. It's a whole system problem.
In Northern Ireland, where there have been pressures too, there were claims that this winter crisis reveals unsolved structural problems.
The level of pressure across the whole system, as in hospital, primary, secondary, pre-hospital in our case, I think is something quite different that we haven't seen, but is reflected everywhere in the United Kingdom, and therefore it is about reform.
The government says it planned for this winter, but with more and more patients waiting for the care they need, the NHS throughout the UK is under more and more strain. Penny Marshall, News at 10.
Well, for all the shortcomings today's figures do identify, one way of interpreting them is that the NHS is a victim of its own success. The more it treats and cures us and keeps us alive, of course, the more we keep coming back in often deteriorating states of health, so therefore increasing demand. Funding is going up, it's true, but not by enough to keep pace with all of that. So should we revise the expectations we place on the health service?
It was Nigel Lawson who once said the NHS is the closest thing the English people have to a religion. And this year, that religion is 70 years old.
This leaflet is coming through your letterbox one day soon.
Founded by the Attlee Labour government in 1948, it rapidly established itself close to the heart of the nation. But we are a very different nation to the post-war one on which the NHS was built. Today, the population is ageing, and the pressure on the NHS is becoming ever greater. Spending on the NHS across the UK has soared since it was founded, from roughly £9 billion in today's prices in 1948 to well over 10 times that amount today. The number of staff in the NHS has also increased steadily since its founding, but so too has demand. In 2003, attendances at major A&Es were 12.7 million, but by 2016 it had risen to 15 million. That's up 18%.
You can't expect that level of demand to be met without providing funding. But it isn't just about money, it's also about the way the money is used across the range of public services. If demand is felt within the A&E department, it's too often it's because we're not investing the funds that are necessary to meet demand for social care, for improved social housing and so forth.
In recent years, NHS spending per head has increased across the UK. Although Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have all spent more than England, but that gap, as you can see, is closing as different spending priorities take effect. However, the head of NHS England, Simon Stevens, says there'll still be a £30 billion funding gap by 2020. So what are the options? A bigger budget. Well, that's probably unlikely, and even with more money, an ageing population is going to push up costs. Better patient accountability. Some trusts have suggested fining people for missing appointments or telling them how much treatment costs. Or should patients be made more aware of when they should and shouldn't go to hospital? All this might help, but experts say demand on the NHS is spiralling.
Unfortunately, what we're trying to do is hit a moving target. The population is growing, and in particular the number of old people is increasing significantly at the moment, so that actually the people who are turning up to A&E tend to be sicker and sicker now, and more of them need to be admitted into hospital. So more money is going in, but more money is not the same as enough money.
Britain is the 6th wealthiest country in the world, yet languishes way down the league table for health spending. That could change, but it will require brave and painful political choices. Ultimately, if we want better healthcare, we're going to have to pay for it. Dan Rivers, News at 10.
Well, Penny was, as you can see, here with me watching Dan's analysis there. Look, we talk about this. We talked about this last winter. We talked about this the winter before. I think for a lot of people, perhaps even for us ourselves, you know, we perpetually talk about crisis. It seems like it's in crisis, but it does feel like there's something slightly different this year, that it's worse, that the response is greater. What's your estimate of it?
Yes, I think you're right. Crisis is perhaps a word that is overused by journalists. The journalists are saying crisis, the politicians are saying midwinter moment.
News or whatever, yeah.
But I have been in hospitals this week and I have noticed a significant difference, and I'm being told there's a significant difference. It's not that the numbers have jumped. There hasn't been a staggeringly huge increase. It's incremental, but it's reached a tipping point. And one of the consultants said it's like weight gain. You know, a pound here, a pound there. You can hide it for a few years, but when it gets to half a stone, it's a problem. And that's what's happened, they believe, some believe on the front line. They've reached a tipping point. And the other thing that I'm consistently hearing is that the cases presenting are now all pretty much really serious, complex and elderly. You haven't got that mixture of A&E, of a sprained ankle, and, you know, got a few of those, but it's really a heavy, serious workload. And on top of that, the other thing I think that's different this year is the social media. Now, not that that is necessarily a good barometer of the crisis, but it's given frontline health workers a voice to vent their frustration. It's making the debate more febrile, making it more emotional, putting more pressure on the politicians. It's only going to get worse. Next week, we've got waiting times, A&E figures. This is, yes, a serious situation.
The social media aspect is interesting, because I guess we're hearing from so many more of them, and that in itself changes the nature of the debate. Penny, well, I have a feeling come back to this, but thank you very much for now.
Let's move on, shall we, to the other story which has been around all week and the latest developments, and this is what's going on in the NHS. There's The Guardian's take on it as Theresa May apologised today for those who've had to see their operations cancelled or postponed.
And I think the politics of this is very interesting. You know, we can argue about whether or not the NHS has enough money. You know, it's all too predictable. Every year there's a winter crisis. This one seems to be worse than many. And, you know, the detail of the cancelled operations is really awful. You know, if you are geared up for an operation and it's cancelled at the last minute, that is a very traumatic thing. You know, you've put arrangements in place, you're probably in pain, that's why you're having the operation in the first place. So I don't in any way want to diminish that, but I think the politics of this is interesting in that what we see here is Theresa May having learnt a bitter lesson over her handling of some of the other crises she's faced. Particularly, I'm thinking of her response to Grenfell, where she was roundly accused of not coming out, not showing her sympathy, not actually getting down to the site of the tragedy and talking to people. And in this case, she's been very quick to get into a hospital, to talk to patients and actually to say sorry, as she had her health secretary do earlier this week. I'm sure Jeremy Hunt would have apologised without being told to do so. But there is nobody now that can say Theresa May has not acknowledged the pain that some people are going through as a result of this.
And I think the acknowledgement of that pain is all very well and good, but I think the question a lot of patients will be asking will be, well, you've apologised, is that extra funding going to be the NHS for the NHS going to be there, given that so many NHS leaders, the the Health Select Committee and Parliament, you've got former health secretaries really saying that we're not matching, you know, we've got an ageing population and we're not matching that with increased funding to the NHS, as we have historically put more money into the NHS. So these aren't unsustainable figures we're talking about. They're quite reasonable numbers, but they don't seem to be forthcoming from the government.
In terms of how much is needed, so how much do you think it is?
So historically, the NHS has had 4% real increases in funding year on year. That's what the NHS says it needs now. I think that's perfectly sustainable. I think actually the public are pretty willing to pay for the NHS as well.
I would agree I would absolutely agree that many people would be prepared even to pay more tax. I mean, some political parties have tried to do this, to introduce
the penny, Gordon Brown's penny on national insurance is one of the only sort of popular tax rises there've ever been, because it was linked to the NHS and spending on the NHS.
Well, no doubt it'll open up that debate once again, won't it?